All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour, where Hong Kong residents showed their disdain for the legislative polls which took place under the new Patriots-only rule imposed by Beijing. And with this, they also recorded the lowest turnout that Hong Kong has witnessed in over 3 decades.
換屆選舉呢喺晚上10點半呢已經結束投票啦，大約有135萬680名選民係投咗票嘅，累積投票率呢係約30.2%。
According to reports that have come in, the voter turnout was just about 30.2%, almost half of the previous legislative polls voter turnout back in 2016. Where, remember, almost about 56 or 58% of the people had cast their votes in 2016 and 44% of the people had cast their votes back in the year 2000. The latest results shown that almost all seats have been taken by pro-Beijing and pro-establishment candidates. Now, the polls in which about 153 candidates had competed for about 90 seats is the first election that is being held since China has overhauled the city's electoral process earlier this year. Now, as per this shake-up that has been effected by Beijing, the proportion of directly elected seats has been reduced and a 2-tiered vetting system was introduced to ensure that what are described as patriots only could in fact run for the office. This means that only 20 of the 90 legislature seats have been directly elected. The largest chunk of the seats, 40, will be picked by a committee of 1,500 staunch China loyalists, while the remaining 30 were chosen by pro-Beijing committees. The voter turnout is a central issue, as observers consider this to be a barometer of the legitimacy of an election, where pro-democracy candidates are largely absent and facing a crackdown from Beijing under the national security law that was introduced in a very controversial manner. But Hong Kong's leader, Carrie Lam, and also the elected candidates did not seem to think that the low voter turnout was an issue at all, saying that the 1.3 million ballots cast were actually a show of support for the improved electoral system in Hong Kong.
Case 其實我想講就係其實個結果係即係要尊重翻選民，即係選民個選擇啦。即係其實大家睇到其實候選人並非係清一色嘅但係其實係大家即係個選擇係點咧？咁我哋要尊重翻選民嗰個決定啊嘛。
All right, now to give us more insights in terms of what these polls in fact mean for Hong Kong, we're joined in by our correspondent Richard Kimber, who's joining us live from Hong Kong with this broadcast. Now, Richard, let me begin by asking you this. This is a poll that's being watched very closely around the world. Just about 30% is said to be the voter turnout. What does it do for the legitimacy of these polls that have been conducted according to the new Patriots-only rules that have been imposed by Beijing?
Well, as you say, the government's dismissing any concerns over the turnout, but it's certainly on the front pages here. This main Chinese language newspaper making it very clear, the main headline here saying record low turnout, and underneath in the sub-headline, the two contrasting perspectives on what that turnout means. The first sub-headline is from the Chinese state media outlet Xinhua News. It says that 1 million people have shown their support for the electoral reforms, referring to the fact that 1 million people did turn out to vote. And next to it, a quote from a local academic saying, you cannot fabricate reality, making the point that just because 1 million people turn out does not mean that the other 3 million that did not should be ignored. So the debate here really whether or not the low voter turnout can give this new legislative chamber some level of credibility when clearly so many people in the public opted, along with some of the calls from democratic advocates here, to not vote as a show of protest against these reforms because they don't like the fact that Beijing is exerting more political influence over the city's electoral systems. And many people who I spoke to on the streets yesterday during the course of what would have been a voting day, had anybody turned out, expressed their frustration that they just didn't feel there were any candidates on the ballot paper who they felt in any way connected to, because so many of the pro-democracy candidates and so many candidates across the political spectrum opted not to take part in this election because of the way that those reforms were managed.
Absolutely, Dita. Generally around the world, the perception is in a democracy, when there is an election, pretty much anyone who is eligible to stand for an election can actually run for a public office. But this election that was held in Hong Kong is slightly different, because the majority of the candidates who could run for the public office were those who were seen as pro-Beijing, and they were vetted according to the Patriots rule. What does it say about this entire electoral process altogether if only those candidates who are vetted by Beijing can actually run for public office in Hong Kong?
Well, the government is saying that there's still a broad representation of society in the legislature, and there's still a broad range of opinion among those candidates who have been vetted. But in reality, what's really happening is there is a broad range of opinion among those candidates when it comes to local issues on, for example, how to restructure the public housing problem here, how to improve social welfare. But when it comes to the bigger questions about the future of Hong Kong's autonomy or the future of universal suffrage, one person, one vote in Hong Kong, these are the types of debates that are likely to be lacking in the legislative chamber going forward, as everybody is effectively on the same page with regards to that discussion, because they're in effect supporting the government and supporting Beijing. So the concern from anybody who's been campaigning over the last few years for more independence for Hong Kong or for more democracy is that this really is the end of that debate, and instead there will be very little, if any, discussion of those types of issues in the legislature. The government, though, and many of the winning candidates in this election are saying that because of the lack of political opposition going forward, it will actually be much easier for them to implement much needed policies without what they accuse the opposition of doing in previous years, which is filibustering and endless interference with government efforts to improve the lives of the average Hong Konger. So they're very happy about this situation, even if the pro-democracy campaigners are not.
All right, my last question to you, Richard, is what is the Chief Executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, saying? Because yesterday morning, when indications had come in that the voter turnout was likely to be very low, she'd come out and said that a low voter turnout, according to her, means that people approve the functioning of the administration. What has she said about the 30% voter turnout that has now been recorded?
Yes, they've been very clear, the government officials, to try and distance themselves from any targets for the election turnout when perhaps it became clear that the turnout might be low. She said, as you mentioned there, that she's trying to spin this as a positive thing for the government. Other winning candidates from pro-Beijing parties have said that, in their opinion, it's only natural for there to be a low turnout because of a different system being in place, which means the public will need to take time to get used to this new electoral process. People on the other side of the democracy camp, of course, dismissing this and saying this is clear evidence of the public apathy towards government now, and a total lack of connection between elected officials and the average people on the street. The challenge for the government going forward is to try and make it clear to the public that because of a more streamlined legislative process now, without the types of long-running debates between opposition parties and the ruling party, that they can in fact improve the lives of Hong Kongers by having a more streamlined policy framework. If that's the case, perhaps the public can be won around, and despite the lack of democratic debate in Hong Kong, perhaps in the longer term the government hopes it can start to win back the public's favour on a mass scale, such that voter turnout will be higher in future elections.
All right, that is something that will be watched in the coming days. Thank you very much indeed, Richard Kimber, for joining us and getting us all those updates there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.